Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you to Under for initiating the invitation and for inviting me back. I also gave a talk a couple of years ago to, I think, maybe a similar group in a somewhat different context, but it was a very enjoyable experience, and I'm very happy to be back. You might not think so, but it's warmer in Minnesota than in Massachusetts, so I'm grateful for that as well. I thought, when I was first invited, I tried to think about what I could talk about in connection with this beautiful exhibit and with the nature of the work that's being done. And what crystallized for me was this notion that one sees a lot. One sees this notion of American Muslim identity, this three-word phrase, American Muslim identity, everywhere. One sees it in the titles of books, one sees it in titles of articles, talks such as this one, entire conferences, book chapters, you name it. There's always some sort, newspaper op-eds, and so forth and so on. And this exact phrase, and very often very close analogs to this phrase, American Muslim identity, appear. And I think it's an important phrase to dwell on in the context of what we're doing today, because it's an ambiguous phrase. It's a laden phrase. It carries with it a great deal of meaning and a great deal, I should say, of confusion. I think it's an important phrase to talk about. The reason I'm mentioning that it's so frequent is that what I'm going to talk about today is not just a phrase that I pulled out of the air and decided to talk about. Google American Muslim identity and then just see how many results come up. And not just small results, but significant results by significant scholars and authors, and you'll see what I mean. Anyhow, what I'd like to do today is to meditate, as it were, on this idea and to see if we can derive any benefit from that. One of the things that it seems to me is that no one is sure exactly what this means, or at least there's not wide agreement on what American Muslim identity means. No one's sure about what it means as a whole, and no one's, I think, is sure of what each of its individual parts even mean. What is American in American Muslim identity? What is Muslim in American Muslim identity? And probably most difficult of all, what is identity in this phrase? Now, I don't think that analyzing and critiquing ideas like this is a waste of time, because it's not just a question of a philosopher or an intellectual parsing words. But as a community, and as a community among communities, we need to be very careful about how we describe ourselves, how we describe our situation, which then enables us to set the proper goals for ourselves. And we can't do this very effectively if we're thinking in the wrong terms, because the language that we use is not simply a function of our thinking, but it also affects our thinking. And what I'm going to argue today is that by using this notion, American Muslim identity, and advocating for it, talking about it in an uncritical way, there are certain pitfalls that we run the danger of falling into. So one of these is that by using this term, we, number one, incorporate or endorse a certain set of assumptions about what human beings are and what the world is. That is to say, when we use the phrase, we're, as it were, affirming or endorsing a worldview. Number two, we're also endorsing or affirming or implicitly agreeing with a relationship of weakness or dependence or inferiority in relation to other groups, which is to say, it carries within it a kind of political statement, a kind of a matter of political attitude, if I can put it that way. And third, it can transmit, again, not openly, not intentionally, but implicitly and unconsciously, an inability to understand our own history as Muslims, to understand the history of our communities, and to also make sense of present-day differences and varieties amongst different kinds of Muslim community. And I want to emphasize that even though I'm going to be critical in this talk, I'm not making the argument that people who talk about American Muslim identity have the wrong intention. I'm talking more about an intellectual question. I'm talking more about how I'm approaching it from a philosophical point of view. We have to be critical and conscious. So let me begin with this idea of identity, and I'll probably spend most of my time talking about that. Muslims, as I said, are always using this word to talk about themselves. And moreover, others use this word to talk about us. And it's not just us. all kinds of communities talk about identity all the time, regardless of the group that you happen to be talking about. Now, in terms of its etymology, identity just has the sense of being the same, or of denoting who someone is or what someone is. So, for example, the very straightforward idea of mistaken identity, or finding the identity of a criminal. And then the idea of the relationship of sameness. That is to say, the relationship between the Netherlands and Holland is one of identity, meaning it's just the same thing. But there are other senses that are commonly used in the public idiom, and these are the ones that are problematic from the point of view of what I'm talking about with this concept. And you'll be familiar with this. People talk about competing identities. Like, so for example, Muslim identity versus American identity. People talk about forging identities, about developing identities, protecting identities, preserving identities, and so forth and so on. Now, I think if one thinks about and just stops and tries to contemplate what these senses of identity are, you discover that it can often be referring to two almost diametrically opposed things. That is to say, identity, when you talk about your identity, it refers to you in the most concrete, intimate, and profound sense, who you are, your identity. But at the same time, if you look at the usage of this word, it can also mean how you are perceived, the perception of you. That is also your identity. That is to say, it can refer to your deepest self, and then it can also refer to a persona. It can refer to your reality, but it can also refer to your image in the eyes of other people. And how strange is it that one word can refer to both your own concrete individuality, your own who you are, and it can also refer to how you're perceived by the personalities of other people. From a certain point of view, these two things are almost completely different and have no overlap. And that's really the problem with the use of this word. It's not an invalid word to use. I'm not criticizing the existence of the word. It's the usage of the word with which we run into problems. You run into a problem of what is sometimes in logic called the fallacy of equivocation. That is to say, we use the word in one sense, or we think it means one thing in one context, and then we hear it again, but it actually means a different thing. So if you're using the word identity in public discourse over and over again, and sometimes it means your deepest individuality, and then sometimes it means a perception, or sometimes it means your place within society, and then sometimes it has something to do with your psychology, this creates confusion. It creates a lot of misunderstanding. You have the same word that can mean sameness and individuality, depending on the context. Even in everyday speech, to identify with someone is to discern sameness between the two of you. But to identify yourself is to state difference. Right? So you can assert sameness and difference with the same word or the same verb. Of course, it's related to identity, identification. These are all related concepts. So what are the actual realities? What are the actual components that we're talking about when we use this word in the way that we would use it when saying something like American Muslim identity? What are the concerns or the hopes or the fears or the principles or the ideas that are meant to be conveyed? That is to say, when someone, for example, talks about, I want to preserve my identity, or I want to construct or forge or develop an American Muslim identity, what are some of the things that perhaps are being spoken about? Well, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean that one wants to develop a sense of not being afraid to take up space in society as determined by one's own beliefs and practices. It can also mean wanting to understand and institutionalize knowledge of where one's beliefs and ways of life come from, knowledge of one's history, and how that relates to other people's histories, and how it determines the present. This would also include understanding how it is that that knowledge of one's history comes under attack from others. Or establishing identity can mean refusing to join the dominant and popular ways of life that are largely determined by materialist, consumerist, and corporate demands on how people should spend their time and expend their resources. It can also mean establishing routines and ways of life that serve as a vessel for the cultivation of human qualities and refinement as determined by one's own priorities and on a firm footing, and not simply in an ad hoc manner where one is simply improvising from day to day trying to cope with the surrounding environment. An environment that one cannot control and often does not fully understand. Or it can mean to find ways of escaping feelings of guilt and dependency that others may use to intentionally or unintentionally control and put a check on us. It can mean establishing bonds of community on the basis of common concerns, friendships, associations, institutions based on what we, that is to say the Muslim community, deem to be worthwhile and good. It can mean to be free from the feeling of being always a guest, or worse, being an interloper, when one actually is a member of the household, or even a victim. That feeling of being on the menu when one's rights place one in a seat at the table. More profoundly, it can mean the desire to find a role, to find a function, to find a purpose, to find a vocation, to find a sense of belonging. Now, one of the points that I'm making is that we should be talking about these things concretely. All right? I just had a list of various desires or concerns or goals that a person might have. And I see no reason to collapse them or to try and catch them all and capture them in one single idea called identity, or establishing or having an identity, because we're fully capable of not using that idea and concretely speaking about these different factors that go into it. Beyond that, or along with that, there's also a question of the simple sloppiness of language that I think, if I can critique this word a little bit further, that it's sometimes used. Let me give you a few examples. Why does one speak of one's racial identity instead of just saying one's race? Why speak of religious identity instead of just saying one's religion? Or why speak of gender identity as opposed to speaking of one's gender? It's like that joke I once heard, I forgot what comedian it was, we talk like this in other domains. We say, let's begin the boarding process. Why not just begin boarding? We kind of elongate words and kind of try and make things more complicated and confused than they actually are. One of the symptoms of this is the fact that when you see this word identity in the title of a book or an article or a speech, it often disappears, not always, but it often disappears for most of the rest of the article, for the content. It makes a brief appearance in the title, maybe in the first sentence, and then it just kind of falls off the radar for the rest of the content. Or, if it's used over and over again, it's rarely defined or discussed to say what it actually means, even though it's quite an ambiguous word. Sometimes it can be used as a euphemism. That is to say, it can obscure or hide expressions that might be too uncomfortable to address. So, for example, if I were to say, or title a talk or an article, "The Problem of Muslim Identity," that sounds a lot more benign than saying the problem of being Muslim. But they're both substantively saying something similar. At a more profound level, though, this is another dimension of that. This common idiom, this common public idiom of talking about establishing an identity, or of forming or forging an identity, has its origin in the modern social sciences. Right? The word identity goes all the way back in the English to the 16th century, but the modern contemporary usage in which that we encounter most commonly has its origin in sociology, psychology, anthropology, and without running through the whole history of it. It can mean a lot of things in these academic disciplines. It can mean individual sense of self, group affiliations, what they call structural positions, ascribed and achieved status, and the list goes on and on and on. Something that can be forged, created, navigated, ascribed, chosen, declared. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which this is talked about. So, what is it? This idea comes out of these disciplines, which themselves rest on a foundation, on a metaphysical or philosophical foundation, which can be called the scientific or the scientistic or the materialist worldview. That is to say, it has a deep underlying foundation in the mechanistic and materialistic view of the world that is orthodoxy in the contemporary academic social sciences, and indeed in most of American mainstream intellectual culture. Now, you may think that's a good thing, or you may think that's a bad thing. What I'm saying is it's the actual fact. Now, one of the main problems with this is the relationship between, or let's say the difference between speaking of identity as that which is you, and identity as that which is a connection between you and others. Let me give you a concrete idea about what I mean. Some in the field of sociology have said that, I suppose ironically, that the holy trinity of identity theory is gender, ethnicity, and class, or race, or gender, race, and class, and that this is a kind of a holy trinity, quote unquote. The significant message from that, though, is that identity then becomes a purely relational reality. That is to say, it's very typical and almost universal in the social sciences to speak about this notion of identity as a function of how it is that you relate to other people, how other people see you, or how you are seen, whether it's by you or the other person in relation to others. That's really what the stuff of identity is. This idea to speak about human beings only in terms of relationships of power, of domination, and so forth, meaning you are a function of your social relationships. Now, if you go into Islamic intellectual history, traditional psychology, for example, what you might find in a book of Sufism or even of just mainstream theology, this is not the way that Islam has tended to conceive of human beings, you might say most profound self. If you say, well, what is a human being? If you go into the classical Islamic tradition, people will talk about, for example, the lower self and the higher self, the passional ego and the spiritual heart, or the spiritual intellect, or just the spirit. They would talk about a hierarchy of the true self and the ego. Of course, psychoanalysis and other psychological disciplines also have this, but it's not exactly the same thing, because those disciplines are also based on an essentially materialist, non-hierarchical sense of what a human being is. Basically, we're reduced to the biological organism. But the way in which we talk about identity doesn't really talk about any of these things, right? When you insist that one's identity is a function of how one relates and connects with other people, what happens to the I? What happens to the thing that is related to other people, right? If I am a function, as some might say, if my identity, the identity of the I, has to do with gender relations, class relations, tensions between race, well, what's the I in the first place that's being put into relation? That's a philosophical question, and it tends to be put off to the side. It's in the margins for most of the disciplines that I'm talking about, so in the social sciences, and it's precisely out of this milieu that we get this way of talking about identity. That's my point. You're introducing, you might say, you're kind of importing a way of speaking which comes from a very specific point of view. And my contention is that we should be able to think and talk and make judgments about ourselves and about our community and about all the realities that fall under this general label identity in the public idiom as it's commonly used, without implicitly endorsing or importing, one might say, this view of the nature of human beings, or this view of the nature of the world, or of what we are and how things work. One usually thinks that identity, and used in this way, again, American Muslim identity or Islamic identity, is a morally and spiritually neutral term. But it is not neutral. It's not ideologically neutral. These terms originate from modern psychology and sociology as surely as id, ego, and superego originate from psychoanalysis, and as surely as the terms proletariat and bourgeoisie come out of Marxism. So, as provocative as this might sound, in a sense, when we talk about Muslim identity, we are unknowingly, perhaps, and this is the pitfall, affirming and buying into an ideology as surely as if we were to say a phrase like helping the Muslim proletariat, or reconciling the Muslim id with the Quranic superego, or the Quranic meta-narrative, for those of you who have studied postmodernism. Now, we may agree with these, actually, that maybe there are some Muslim Marxists among us who think that's perfectly fine. But it's a question of knowing that this is where the term comes from, and that, in a sense, you're implicitly affirming it by using it in a way that's, in a sense, unconscious and uncritical. Now, does that mean that there are not legitimate uses for it? Of course not. It's a perfectly fine word in English, but it should be used judiciously, and it should be reserved, in my opinion, for talking about one's individual reality, right, for one's most profound sense of self, and not as a function of what other people think of you. We should talk about that in other ways, because what's the problem there? The problem then is that you have no power over saying what your identity is. It's in the hands of everyone else, rather than being in your hands. So if that's what identity is, what's the word for the thing that you actually are in yourself? You have to reach for other terms. So we should reserve words like identity or essence for that very profound and individual aspect of ourselves. Or, in a more metaphysical sense, it can be used to describe that which is common to all human beings, but of course now we're getting into more metaphysical, philosophical matters, right? One's identity as a human being. But that doesn't have to do with social interactions. And of course, the everyday sense of identity as the same, or of something, being, of knowing the identity of a person or something. I mean, of course, those are, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the, you might say, the social science derived sense of what identity means. What about American? What about this notion of American and American Muslim identity? We don't always mean, when we say this, a simple legal or geographic fact, because otherwise anybody who stepped off the plane with a visa in his or her hand would immediately come into possession of American Muslim identity, and that's not usually what people mean when they say American Muslim identity. They're usually getting at some kind of moral judgment, right? Not a factual question, but a judgment about good and bad, about worthy and unworthy, belonging or not belonging. And these are judgments. It's not the legal status of a citizen or resident, which is not a judgment or value. And it's not a matter of geographic location, which is also not a judgment of value. But it has to do with customs and loyalties and priorities, and as I said, belonging. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is perhaps a little bit provocative, but I would argue that when one is arguing or trying to defend whether and how one is American, American the adjective, not American the noun, if I can say it, then the battle's already lost. You've already lost. Because there's a hidden loyalty oath in such discussions. It's an oath that one side is demanding of the other, whether it's conscious or unconscious. For a huge number of people who use American as a value predicate, good American, bad American, real American, it means, for some, a segment of the population, for example, a white-dominated, militaristic, capitalistic country that is exceptional and special among the nations of the world, to the degree that if you reject these traits, you might be subject to the label un-American, or anti-American, or fake American. There's another segment of the population for whom American is a reference to our national institutions and the norms that we have, and the values enshrined in the country's founding documents, such as the Bill of Rights, and especially the Bill of Rights. And others, of course, have other sentimental notions of what it means to be American. But even before we can decide which of these is right, we have to realize that, as a matter of fact, the problem is that Muslims, in talking about what being an American is, at this historical moment, there's a way in which this is spoken about that is reserved solely for Muslims. In other words, the question of American or not seems to be its own special discussion when it comes to Muslims at this historical time. If a Muslim, for example, vehemently speaks out against the desecration of the Quran, he can expect to have his understanding of what it means to be an American called into question. Lectures that might begin with the words, "in this country, we," so forth and so on. But if Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, the former mayor of New York, shuts down a museum exhibit, which he did, that desecrates an icon of the Virgin Mary, he may be told that he does not understand free speech, or that he's a bully, or that he does not understand government power, but he won't be called un-American. That is to say, we have a special way of criticizing that is reserved for outsiders, and we have to be aware of that. Indeed, the unqualified use of American as a value predicate, right? Not as a factual matter, right? Obviously, we're all Americans, that's in that sense, right? But when used as a value predicate, it is often a question of the powerful trying to keep the weak in line, or a doubting person casting suspicion on someone else, whether in the form of intimidation, "Are you American enough?" or emotionally or psychologically manipulatively, as in the kind of "we are all in this together" sentimentality that is either trying to stifle criticism or sell you something. Moreover, the defensive statement that you hear from Muslims a lot, and it's natural and it's understandable, I'm not being critical of it, where one says, "we are just as American as you," there's an implicit statement, "we are not a threat to you." Well, what about the threat that is posed to Muslims? Do others ever feel the need to declare their American identity to Muslims when a mosque is vandalized or a Muslim cabbie is attacked? By any objective standard, based on the avowed and public meaning of what it means to be American, it is the vandal and the attacker who do not, quote-unquote, belong here, which we often hear, this idea of belonging here, or it is they who should go back to their own country, because their actions are, in a sense, much more, quote-unquote, anti-American than those of those who are attacked. Unless, of course, the attacker is an Apache or a Navajo, in which case he would stay here. although I don't think that's happened. So. The question of who defines American is at issue here. American in the public in the public idiom, right? Not its real meaning, but in the public way of speaking about it, is a word that Muslims, because of their current relative absence of clout and power, do not really have a role in defining. We can only conform to it or fail to conform to it. It is out of our power, and yet we find ourselves trying to submit to it or to align ourselves with it. So what should we talk about instead? Well, there's a whole litany of things that we could talk about instead. One could talk about being a good or a bad citizen, or a good or bad member of society, or good or bad neighbor, friend, worker, businessman, businesswoman, soldier, statesman, scholar, student, member of a family. I also want to be clear that I don't mean by this that Muslims should somehow be hostile to people who want to know about them. Muslims should teach others about Muslims. Who else is going to do it? Muslims know the most, so they have a duty to teach. It's not wrong for a neighbor to introduce themselves to a neighbor when they move into a neighborhood. It's a very natural and wholesome thing. And one should participate in educating the American public about the American public, of which Muslims are a part. It should be looked at that way. But it should not be done in the form of a cross-examination with a spotlight on us. It should be done on a footing of equality, everyone being a member of the household. And again, I'm not trying to say that there are not valid ways to use it. One can say American the way that you would say Minnesotan or New Yorker, which is the right way to use it, which is the proper way to use these kinds of terms. Finally, I want to talk about the term Islamic. I should say Muslim. And sometimes it's the word Islamic. They both work here. And here we run into problems similar to that of using the word American. That is to say, it can become a term of abuse. It could become a term of manipulation when it's used as a value predicate. But the problem here is that it's not other people doing it to us. We're doing it to ourselves most often when it's used incorrectly, right? When you get into discussions of good Muslim, bad Muslim, real Muslim, or into the much more sensitive and complex idea of Islamic and un-Islamic, which is very fraught. As with the adjective American, the adjective Islamic can carry with it all sorts of judgments and decisions that remain mute and hidden under this catch-all label. Let me give you an example. If you read through the classical tradition, especially in the tradition of jurisprudence, for example, but in any of the disciplines, Quran commentary, logic, science, you name it, our predecessors in any Islamic language would not have understood a sentence that was framed in the following way. For example, that article of clothing is un-Islamic, which, as you probably know, would be spoken as a form usually of censure or criticism to the person, let's say, who's wearing that article of clothing, right? Not a factual question of, well, that article of clothing comes from Japan and not from, right? It's usually a value judgment when you say something like that. And of course, I want to make clear here that there are valid and indispensable and crucial ways in which the label Muslim and even Islamic should be used, but we should resist using them as ideological terms that are meant to set us in opposition to this or that, for example, setting us in opposition to the West or against some other group of Muslims. Islamic should be properly used to denote that which originates and is constituted by the sources of Islam. That's the proper way to use it. The Quran and the teachings of the Prophet. So, for example, Islamic law, Islamic theology. This is very valid ways to use this term. But it should not be used as a stand-in for judgments that one should use, for judgments that are the actual thing that we're talking about. Rather, we should talk about what is good, or righteous, or pious, or modest, or humble, or generous, or just. In other words, whose meaning is more public and concrete, and most importantly, not subject to manipulation by the powerful over the weak. The central question is, who gets to decide and define Muslim or Islamic and bestow labels on other people about who's really a Muslim and who's maybe not so much a Muslim, or who's Islamic and un-Islamic? These, in a sense, are unwieldy and fraught labels when they're used in that way. Not in every way, but when they're used in that specific way. Again, to get back to the classical scholars, why didn't the great scholars of the past, these people who could write 20 volumes on aspects of the Quran and Islamic law, why didn't they talk about Islamic and un-Islamic? Why is it almost impossible to find this adjective used? Well, because they were too busy discussing the different opinions that Muslims had, and which, though they disagreed with them, they were quite ready to respect and to discuss openly. They were very comfortable with disagreement and variety, and hence they didn't use abusive terms like, you're un-Islamic. They would just say, I disagree, or I think that what you're saying will lead to such and such outcome, but never these kind of ideological catch-all terms. To overly rely on the label like Islamic or Muslim, which again I want to emphasize we cannot do without, can potentially demonstrate or lead to an inability to deal with a range of differing opinion and honest disagreement among Muslims themselves. We need to be able to conceive of our challenges and goals with a greater level of sophistication and possibility, and a possibility of variation, than simply classifying things into Muslim or not, Islamic or not. We need a richer vocabulary for talking about some of these realities. When we render ourselves unable to conceive of these underlying human qualities, like I mentioned before, of good, righteous, pious, modest, humble, generous, just, we naturally then start talking about Muslim this and Islamic that for everything. And we then see our own position, the opinion I happen to hold at the moment, as the Muslim thing or the Islamic position. And we do this reflexively and not with malice, but we do it unconsciously and unintentionally often as a kind of a habit. And we often find ourselves dismissing out of hand, or sometimes condemning out of hand, other people because we lack the conceptual tools and the experience to actually understand diversity, varieties of opinion, questions of emphasis, and disagreements that Muslims have had since there have been Muslims. Okay, so that's a lot of critique for things. But what are some positive ways in which one can think about these things? What are some solutions that I could perhaps propose in place of talking, instead of just saying, never talk about American Muslim identity, right? There are better ways, perhaps, I would suggest, respectfully, to talk. So, for example, rather than identities, conflicting identities, multiple identities, identity crisis, a term which, by the way, dates back only to the 1950s and again comes out of psychology. We shouldn't use these terms so carelessly, right? Instead of identities, we should speak more often of communities. We can speak of circles of people. We could speak of worlds. We could speak of roles or places in society, right? Rather than multiple identities, why not speak about overlapping communities? Isn't that really what it is? Why don't we emphasize the notion of intersection rather than opposition? For example, and you see this a lot, the example of American identity and Muslim identity. These two are often juxtaposed together. Instead of talking about that American identity versus Muslim identity, let's talk about how one's religion relates to one's civic obligations. Why not? What's missing if I say it that way instead of the first way? How our religion relates to our civic obligations and our common life as human beings. Rather than accepting to talk about whether you're American enough, let's forget the idea that anyone, and here I'm getting a little bit, this is a question I think is important for us to get maybe a little bit combative about, not too much, but a little bit. Let's forget the idea that anyone who doubts whether you belong in your own country deserves an answer. Let's speak about common principles, but not bow to the self-interested or ignorant expectations by others. And let us understand that we are members of the household and not guests or interlopers. Again, not with an attitude of opposition or of hostility, but with an attitude of dignity and self-respect and of knowledge of what the actual situation is, and not with a sense of dependency or of inferiority, which are inappropriate, I think, to our community. And finally, let's take care when we say Muslim or Islamic in a careless and haphazard way. Let's not use them as a club to beat other Muslims over the head, or to plaster in a kind of with carelessness and label someone as fake or un-Islamic, simply on the basis of the fact that we disagree with them. We have such a rich tradition of spirituality and of law and of science and basically the entire swath of the intellectual tradition, and we have such profound meditations on human nature and on the nature of society. We have a lot to draw from, and so we shouldn't allow ourselves to get into the habit of thinking that there's one Islamic thing to do and that everything else outside of that is un-Islamic. This leads to a certain intellectual stagnation, and it stunts our cultural and intellectual growth. Finally, let me conclude by saying that this is not, I think, a mere parsing of words. I think we should avoid ideas whose meaning is vague and which we have little power to define. And when we do this, when we can maybe be careful about just carelessly saying things like identity or American identity or Muslim identity in a way that's not reflective, we find ourselves with one less obstacle to interpreting our experience, our Muslim experience, if I can borrow the title of the exhibit. So next time you find yourself about to use an abstract and mercurial word such as identity or Muslim identity or American Muslim identity or culture or authority or any of these other very ambiguous, important but ambiguous terms, pause, see if you can find a different idea to express it, and then see what happens. I think it's a fruitful exercise, and I think it's the direction which we should go in our community. Thank you very much.
I think Dr. Janner deserves another round of applause for that wonderful talk. Thank you so much. It's very, very impressive talk. Thank you.